He tried to cast love spells to fix his wife. It's not whimsical magic. It's not talking about a fairy tale or a fantasy. It's a desperate defense mechanism used to force an object to comply. Look at his eyes right here. Just stay on that for a second. In clinical terms, we call this the avoidant eye gaze. Usually you see this with social anxiety or someone who's feeling a bit shy. But in the context of a man pleading in court, facing charges, it's a massive psychological anomaly. His eyes are hiding in plain sight. Rapid blinking and avoidant eye gaze during a missing person search party. So what happened right back years ago when his wife went missing. You could see it. His eyes were blinking during that time. Typically, this indicates social anxiety or situational shyness. But during the search and after that and during the courts, it was something much more darker. It's a massive psychological indicator. It's the nervous system that screams the truth while the brain works overtime to maintain a fabricated reality. People will look at this footage, they'll look at the photos, and they see a man under stress. Maybe it's a guy who just is overwhelmed by the cameras. But when I look at this, I see something else. It's much deeper. I see a man struggling to maintain a fabricated reality that he's trying to hide for over all these years. It's like his brain is working so hard to keep the story straight while his entire body, his nervous system, wants to scream the truth. The eyes tell everything. Even when the face and the body is trying to say something else, the eyes are going to reveal the truth. It's a sustained inability to maintain a focus for a standard period of time. It's erratic. It blinks. It looks everywhere else. It dodges. But it's telling. The avoidant eye gaze is the sustained inability to maintain a focus on a central stimulus. It's erratic. It indicates high cognitive load and a psychological stress response during questioning. It's a pathological avoidance that is clearly observed. The subject, or in this case, Robert, presents a non-confrontational posture. The rapid eye movements, though, is misinterpreted as emotional distress by lay observers. The narrative aligns with the societal expectations of grief. We expect certain people to act certain ways during grief, if it's genuine grief. A nervous system screaming the truth while the brain works overtime to keep the narrative straight. The nervous system indicates the pupil dilation and the tracking instability. It's revealed in the eyes. Resources are diverted to fabrication and suppression of authentic responses. And that results in leaky microexpressions and avoidant gaze patterns. When I first started going through this case file for Larry and Maya Millete, I actually had to stop. I had to get up and step away from my desk for a few minutes. It wasn't just the tragedy of Maya's disappearance and her murder, although that's heartbreaking. It was the sheer volume of coercive control that was documented in those final weeks. It's dense, it's heavy, and it's incredibly revealing. As a licensed professional counselor, I don't just see a husband who lost his wife. I see a textbook case of what I call decompensation. I've talked about this before in other videos. It's a term that we use when someone's psychological defenses, like the walls that they built to stay normal, finally start to crumble and crash. They can't hold the mask up anymore. And in Larry's case, that crumbling started way before Maya went missing. Today, though, we're not just looking at what Larry did. The news has covered the what and the where for years. We're going to look instead at the why. Why couldn't he stop himself? What was happening inside his mind that made him think that he could control the uncontrollable? We're going to spend a lot of time in this video talking about the victim mask. This is not the first time I've talked about this. This is a clinical architecture of control, and Larry was a master of it behind closed doors. We're going to peel back that victim mask. This is a sophisticated layer of psychological armor that people use to hide their tracks, just exactly what Larry was doing. But here's the thing about masks. They always, and I mean always, slip. We're going to look at the psychological indicators that we're hiding in plain sight. These are indicators that once you see them, you can never unsee them. In fact, you'll start seeing them in the world around you too. I know that this is a lot. This is a heavy case. But we can take a breath. We can slow it down. I want to make sure that we're looking at this through the right lens. I'm John Cordray. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I've spent literally thousands of hours in my office with people, watching how they process grief, anger, and loss. And I want to be very clear here. Everything that I'm sharing today is my professional speculation. It's based on public records and the behaviors that I've observed. It's not a formal diagnosis of Larry or anyone involved in this case. It's a clinical deep dive, a clinical breakdown of what I believe was happening in Larry's mind. People often look at the Larry Millete case and they see a mystery. They see a puzzle with missing pieces. But as a therapist, when I look at the timeline of his behavior, I don't just see a mystery. I see the mind that was fracturing. I see a specific tragic trajectory that was set in motion months before the search parties ever started for Maya. All right, I think we're ready. Let's dive into this clinical file. To really get inside the mind of Larry, we have to look at what I call the architecture of his control. It's such a deliberate word, architecture, because it wasn't some accidental spiral or in the heat of the moment reaction. This was built. This structure was built piece by piece, layer by layer. This isn't just about a bad marriage. We've all seen bad marriages. I've helped marriages through some of the most difficult times. We've all seen couples who argue or grow apart. Maybe you've experienced that. But this is something much different. This is about a deep-seated, almost cellular, pathological need for dominance. This architecture of control, we're going to deconstruct the pathology of Larry. We're going to kind of do a clinical autopsy, if you will, of that course of control. When I look at Larry's history, I'm searching for a foundation of that architecture. I'm looking for the first bricks that were laid. Now, I can only rely on the public records and reports of his earlier life, but even there, you start to see the glimmers of what we call a rigid personality structure. Think about that term for a second, rigid. In a healthy psyche, there's flexibility. When life gives you a no, or when your partner expresses a different opinion, a healthy person might get frustrated. They might argue, but they bend. They can adapt. But for someone with a rigid personality, bending feels like breaking. It's not an option. It's a threat to their very existence. Here's an example of what a rigid personality structure looks like. For many people, we have a flexible structure. It adapts to the frustration and the differing opinions. You're going to get into an argument. You're going to get into conflict. You might even get really heated and angry, but eventually you adapt. You compromise. You come to a place where you can adapt through that conflict. But with a rigid personality, bending feels like breaking. It's a threat to existence. There's not an option here. You either go my way or we break. This obsession with order and discipline is often a control mechanism born of deep unacknowledged insecurity. If they can control every variable, then they feel safe. There were some reports from those who knew Larry in his younger years, even back to his time in the military, that described a man who was intensely focused on order, on things being just so. They had to be exactly right, according to him. Now, on the surface, that looks like a high achiever. It looks like someone who's disciplined. But as a clinician, I'm looking at the why behind that discipline. Is it because the value of work is excellent? Or is it because they are terrified of what happens if they lose control? I want to pause here for a second because I'm realizing right now that as I'm talking through this, I have seen this many times play out in my practice. It's that when a person who feels that if they can just control every single variable in their environment, their finances, their schedule, and eventually even the partner, then they'll finally be safe. They'll finally feel relaxed and at ease. It's a control born out of a deep, unacknowledged insecurity. In Larry's case, this rigidity seems to have calcified into a specific type of obsession. You look at the reports of his behavior leading up to Maya's disappearance, that constant monitoring, the alleged spell casting that we're going to talk about in a minute, and the sheer desperation to fix something that he saw as broken because it wasn't following his script. That's not love. That's a frantic attempt to repair a crack in his own psychological foundation. If Maya left, that whole structure, the whole architecture that he built his identity on was going to collapse, and he was not going to let that happen. This brings us to a phenomenon that really stands out in Larry's case here. It's called magical thinking. Most of us associate magical thinking with childhood, thinking if you step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. Do you remember doing that? But in a clinical setting, when an adult uses it, it's often a desperate defense mechanism against reality that they can no longer control. Magical thinking functions as a psychological circuit to bypass. It starts with control, that obsessive, coercive control, wanting to control her presence and the finances. And then there's that fear of a loss of a direct control of Maya. There's something wrong in the marriage. Maya might leave. I am going to turn to magical thinking. I'm going to go to a psychic and cast a love spell. There is the cognitive bypass. It completely bypasses all rational thought. And then it goes into a universal compliance. It's not whimsical magic. It's not talking about a fairy tale or a fantasy. It's a desperate defense mechanism used to force an object to comply. It's called psychological enmeshment. Maya is viewed not as a human with a free will and that she can leave as she wanted to, but she was viewed as a malfunctioning object needing a remote control, needing a spell to fix her. It's that final bridge before rigid behavior turns violent. Larry wasn't just monitoring Maya. He was allegedly reaching out to spellcasters and psychics in order to fix her, to force her to stay. As a therapist, I don't look at that and see someone who is simply believing magic as a fairy tale, like wanting to find a magic bottle and get a magic genie. I see a man who's experiencing a profound cognitive bypass. The cracks in this magical thinking start to crumble. It's a direct response to coercive control. If she's not going to change, I am going to go to somebody to try to change her and to fix her. When Maya stops reacting, that's when the cognitive bypass begins. And then the dominance comes, going to a psychic to cast spells, love spells. He thought he can control. He thought he can go to someone to help him control Maya. This isn't some simple little whimsical belief. This is not a fairy tale. This is not something that you wish upon a star. It's a desperate defense mechanism. He wants to control everything, even the cosmic presence if he can. But once the magic fails, the only tool left is force. When his direct coercive control over Maya stopped working, when she stopped reacting to his demands, his brain had to find a new way to exert dominance. If he couldn't control her through physical presence or financial pressure, then he tried to order her compliance through the universe itself, cosmic belief. Maybe if I go to a psychic, then I can cast a love spell, and then she'll love me again and stay. It's a terrifying level of grandiosity. It suggests that in Larry's mind, his will was so important that the laws of nature should bend to accommodate it. That is magical thinking. That's distorted thinking. And he believed it. When I hear about behaviors like this, it is a major warning sign of psychological enmeshment. He didn't see Maya as a human, as his wife, with free will that she can leave as she wanted to. He saw her as his possession, and it was malfunctioning. It was like looking for something that was broken, and he was the only one that could fix it. He wanted to control her in order to fix her, to keep her in the marriage. This magical thinking loop is the final bridge before a rigid personality turns into a violent one. Because once the magic fails, and it did, and it will, the only tool left in the box is extreme violence, is to act in a horrific way. I actually had a thought while I was reviewing the timeline of this case and their move. It's like he was trying to curate this perfect suburban life, but it was a life where he was the sole director. And when the lead actress, Maya, wanted to change her lines or leave the stage or rewrite the script, that's when the victim mask starts to slip. And you see the underlying rage of the architect whose building is being condemned. Let me just stop here again for a second. I know that's a lot to process. A husband is going after his wife. I can feel it as I'm saying this. We're talking about the dismantling of a human being's autonomy. The reason why I'm going this deep and the reason I'm dissecting the why is because this actually matters to you. Understanding these patterns of control isn't just about solving a true crime mystery. It's about a vital clinical skill that I want you to learn. It's about learning to spot the difference between someone who is intense and someone who is coercive. It's about recognizing when someone's need for order has crossed the line into a need for dominance. And I want to keep doing these kind of deep clinical dives because I believe that the more we understand these psychological blueprints and the red flags, the better we can protect ourselves and the people we care about. Think about how that rigidity would have reacted to a divorce. In a rigid personality structure, divorce isn't a legal proceeding. It's an ego death. If he couldn't be the one in control, then he would rather there be nothing left to control at all. A rigid personality interprets bending as breaking. We talked about that. Bending is compromising. Bending is being willing to acknowledge that maybe you're wrong and wanting to resolve the conflict. It takes two to argue and two to resolve. And the stress test is when the pressure pushes down on that elastic. The pressure is building. And then catastrophic failure, fracture overload. It crumbles. The core insecurity is born from a profound, unacknowledged vulnerability. And there is a threat. Bending to a partner's autonomy is that threat. And that is not going to be allowed. For someone like Larry, the victim mask that he wore during the early interviews was his last-ditch effort to maintain that architecture. He was trying to control the public perception, just like he tried to control Maya's reality. But as we move into this next phase of the breakdown, you're going to see exactly where he made his biggest clinical mistake. The moment where his need to be right outweighed his need to be innocent. That's what happens when the architecture is built on a lie. Eventually, the weight of the truth becomes too much for the foundation to hold. And we're going to look at the exact moment that collapse happened. This section of the case is when the clinical picture starts to get really uncomfortable because we're moving from the blueprint into the actual behavioral breakdown. I want to go back to that photo of Larry during the trial. Really look at that again. Look at his eyes. Look at his behavior that he was exhibiting. When we think about the search, when Maya first went missing, lots of people, the community came out and they wanted to help. But this is where a lot of people get confused and they ask, why wasn't he out there with the flashlights working and looking? Why wasn't he the one leading the charge to find his wife? Well, from my perspective, he didn't just step back or get overwhelmed. He redirected. In the world of mental health, this is a classic, almost textbook indicator of something called narcissistic injury. I talk about this all the time. When we hear the word injury, we think of a wound. But for someone with these specific traits, a narcissistic injury isn't a physical cut. It's a profound threat to their ego. It's an internal cut. And when Maya began to pull away, when she started talking about divorce and talking to lawyers and establishing her own life, Larry didn't feel the kind of grief that you or I might feel. He didn't feel a sense of impending loss or sadness for the relationship. No, he felt a loss of ownership. This is a narcissistic injury that triggers an ego death. It's not normal grief. Normal grief is the feeling of impending loss of the relationship. It's a profound sadness and emotional processing. It takes time. Everybody grieves differently. That's healthy grieving. But a narcissistic injury is a loss of ownership and total submission, not the relationship. Identity as a successful husband is shattered, and that drive to punish the person who broke his reality. Actually, let me pivot here slightly because ownership is almost too simple of a word. It's not just that he wanted to own her like a piece of property. It's that his entire identity, his whole sense of being as a successful man and husband was tied directly to her submission. As long as she remained under his thumb, his world made sense. And the moment she stood up, his world shattered. And a shattered man doesn't look for a missing wife. He looks for a way to punish the person who broke his reality. The core message of this narcissistic injury for Larry is that divorce is not a legal proceeding, it's the ego death. It's like the cord is completely chopped off and it falls and breaks apart completely. And when Maya established her independence and decided that she was leaving, Larry didn't grieve. He felt a profound loss of that ownership. She was leaving the one thing that he felt control over, and that shattered him. And this is where his impression management started to glitch. We all do a little bit of impression management. You dress up for a job interview. You might go on a date and you want to look nice. You might act polite at dinner. I hope you do. But Larry was on a different level. He was trying to play the part of the concerned husband. But because he was experiencing this massive internal decompensation, the mask kept slipping. You can see it so clearly in the way he spoke to the media. If you listen to his interview or watched some of his interviews, you'll notice the tone. It was off. It was a little too clinical, too detached. He would talk about the situation or the investigation with a same emotional weight that you might use to describe a car repair. And that was the language of someone who was already disassociated from the human element of the case. In his mind, Maya had already ceased to be a person. She had become the problem to be managed. It's that detached tone that starts to discuss the investigation as if it's a common, ordinary thing. It bypassed all processing and then centers on the survival and control centers. And when Maya ceased to be a person in his eyes, she became a narrative and a problem to be managed. And this starts the decomposition cascade. The rigid structure is that deep insecurity that's masked by obsessive control. And then it leads to an autonomy threat. That threat and that target expresses free will. That's the catalyst. And then the cognitive bias is the magical thinking that's deployed to force compliance. And then the narcissistic injury. It's the loss of the ownership, not the relationship, that shatters the controller's identity. And then the mask glitches. It's that impression management. It fails altogether. It's a detachment that takes over. And then lastly, the structure, the architect, the foundation collapses. It's a total decomposition and destruction. We see that timeline in Larry's case. When a clinician sees that kind of detachment, that type of detachment during a crisis, it's a massive red flag, and we look very carefully. It tells us that the emotional processing center of the brain has been bypassed by survival and a control centers. He wasn't grieving because psychologically he had already replaced Maya. There was nothing to grieve. He already knew what happened to her. He wanted to control the narrative of her disappearance. The mask has this impression management. It's a sophisticated layer of armor that's used to hide the real things going underneath, to hide their tracks. The reality that's under the mask is that decomposition. It's the crumbling of psychological defenses when the controller can no longer maintain a normal facade. The mask slips entirely. There's another layer here that I really need to address, and it's called proxy control. Larry didn't just limit his control to Maya. He tried to weaponize their entire social and family ecosystem. Allegedly, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, he was reportedly sending constant, desperate messages to her family, trying to recruit them to his side. In clinical terms, this is a form of triangulation. He was trying to create a reality where Maya was the unstable one, and he was the saintly, stable husband trying to save the family. This is a common tactic for someone with a high degree of narcissistic vulnerability. They can't handle being the villain in anyone's story, so they preemptively strike to destroy the other person's reputation first. But look what happens to the boundaries here. A healthy husband respects the boundary between his marriage and his in-laws. But Larry exhibited a boundary disillusion. He felt entitled to Maya's family's loyalty, just as he felt entitled to her time and her body. When they didn't give him the total submission by proxy he demanded, his frustration didn't just simmer, it boiled. This is a proxy war that weaponizes the entire social ecosystem. Maya was the victim. Maya was missing at the time. And then Larry reached out to family, to in-laws, to friends. He began to manipulate vulnerability. He began to bring out a sense of empathy and sadness and sympathy. He started to control the situation again. That triangulation is creating a reality where the target is unstable and the controller is the savior. Hey, she went missing. She lost it. She had some breakdown. I need your help to find her. Do you see how that triangulation works? It's a total alliance that he's trying to make. This is why the victim mask is so dangerous. He used it to garner sympathy from her own blood relatives, effectively trying to isolate her within her own support system. When a controller loses their proxy power, they feel completely exposed. And an exposed controller is at their most dangerous because they feel they have nothing left to lose but their pride. Here's another example of this, that Larry is the controller. He's in the middle. He reaches out to external contacts, Maya's friends, anybody he can think of, and he reaches out to her family. He starts to build this alliance with them. He's weaponizing the ecosystem to cast Maya as that unstable person. He's the one that's stable. He's trying to destroy a partner's reputation to avoid being the villain. He expected loyalty. He expected time. He expected submission of the partner's blood relatives and friends and external contacts. He was developing his architecture here. Hey friends, if you're finding this clinical breakdown of Larry interesting, I would love for you to karate chop that subscribe button. Now I want to talk about the interrogation because this is where it gets really interesting. There's one specific indicator during the interrogation that most people miss completely. It's not a loud confession or a dramatic outburst. It's much more subtle than that. And it's the moment his victim mask completely fell off. And for a split second, we saw the real Larry. It happened when the investigators stopped asking about Maya and started questioning his timeline. Suddenly, the grieving husband persona vanished. His posture shifted. He leaned forward. His voice got lower. His eyes, remember those avoidant eyes that we talked about at the beginning? They changed. They became sharp and even cold. This is what I call narcissistic rage bubbling just underneath the surface. It's a reaction that occurs when a person's perceived superiority or control is challenged. In that moment, he wasn't worried about Maya anymore. He was worried about being caught in a mistake. For a man whose entire architecture was built on being the one in control, being wronged or trapped is the ultimate nightmare. Narcissistic rage surfaces when dominance is challenged. And as the victim, once he was questioned about Maya, it began a narcissistic rage that was triggered. It triggered the cold strategist, and his mask was slipping in real time. The internal working model just can't tolerate a reality that he did not create. He wasn't in control anymore. He abandons the grieving persona instantly, and then he defends his dominance, not his innocence. That's key here. He's defending his dominance. He's showing that he's dominant, not showing he's innocent. A lot of people will look at that moment and look at the photos, and they see a guy getting defensive. But as a therapist, I see an internal working model going on here. It's of a man who can't tolerate the reality that he's not the one in control anymore. He wasn't defending his innocence at all. He was afraid that he was losing his dominance. When you see that shift from the wounded victim to the cold strategist, you're looking at the core of the pathology. This wasn't a man who lost his way. This was a man who had a very specific path. And when Maya stepped off that path, he decided that nobody would be allowed to follow her. It's a heavy realization. It's one of those things that once you see the clinical pattern, the mystery of his behavior starts to evaporate. And you're left with something much more calculated and also much more tragic. I want you to think about how this need for submission can manifest in other areas, because the victim mask isn't unique to Larry. It isn't unique to the villains. It's a tool used by many, and knowing how to spot the glitch is a skill that can change how you see the world. Larry's case is a dark, sobering reminder of what happens when a pathological need for control meets a fracturing psyche. It's easy to look at the headlines and see this as a true crime story. But as we've seen today, this is a clinical progression. The psychological indicators weren't just there, they were screaming. The grandiosity, the long-term coercive tactics, and that chilling lack of genuine affect that we saw in the footage in those eyes. These weren't random symptoms. They were a part of a cohesive, destructive personality structure. When we look at this case from a mental health perspective, we have to talk about the macro lesson here. And that lesson is about the danger of the unchallenged narrative. Larry lived in a world where he was the director, the writer, and the hero. When Maya tried to exit the stage, her entire internal world collapsed. This is what we call the psychological entrapment. Larry didn't just feel like he was losing a wife. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality itself. And for a personality like this is important here, this is a key, that is a fate worse than death. It's why we saw that victim mask used so strategically. He wasn't just trying to fool the police. He was trying to force the world to agree with his version of the truth. He needed to be the victim because the alternative, being the perpetrator of his own family destruction, was something his psyche literally couldn't process. The unchallenged narrative creates a psychological entrapment that looks like this. The director is one who needs control over the script and the actors. He must cast himself as the victim because his psyche can't process being the perpetrator. And then when the target attempts to leave, the internal world of his collapses. Now, I want you to think about how this applies to the world around you. We all encounter people who have a hard time with no. We all see people who struggle when they aren't the ones in charge. But there is a massive clinical difference between a difficult person and a coercive controller. A difficult person might argue with you, but a coercive controller tries to redefine your reality. They use gaslighting, they use isolation, and they use impression management to make sure that even when they are causing the most harm, they still look like the ones being hurt. That's the victim mask in action. It's a tool of survival for the fragile ego, but it's a weapon against everyone else. To put this in a diagnostic table of a difficult person versus a coercive controller, when someone reacts to a no, a difficult person may argue and push back and they get frustrated. But someone who is coercive experiences ego threat. They use force or manipulation to eliminate defiance. The reality management, a healthy, difficult person disagrees on the facts or perspectives. They have differences of opinion. But someone who is coercive redefines reality entirely. They start to gaslight you and isolate you. With conflict positioning, a difficult person may accept mutual blame or holds a grudge. But someone who is coercive employs impression management to ensure they always appear as the victim. It's always about them. The reason why I'm so passionate about these clinical breakdowns isn't just to talk about the monsters in the news. It's to give you the vocabulary and the clinical eyes to see the patterns early. Prevention doesn't happen in the courtroom. It happens long before that. It happens in the living room, in the office, and in our own awareness of these psychological red flags. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, I've seen that mask before, or I know someone who uses that kind of redirection, then this analysis has done its job. We're not just spectators here. We're students of human behavior. And when we look at this case, after everything we've unpacked, from the developmental blueprint to the behavioral breakdown during the search, I want you to ask yourself a very serious question. When you look at his behavior, his interviews, and his clinical decomposition, do you see a man who simply snapped? A man who was pushed too far by a bad marriage or just lost it one night? Or do you see something much more profound? Do you see a psychological pattern that, given the right triggers and a loss of control, was almost inevitable? Because there's a big difference between a snap and a structure. A snap is an accident. A structure is a choice made over and over again until it becomes a cage. This case is a tragedy for Maya, for her children, and for her family. But for us, it's also a warning. It's a call to look deeper, to listen to our clinical gut, our instincts, our intuition, and to recognize that the most dangerous masks are the ones that look exactly like the face of a victim. If you want to see how the same victim mask behavior, that same glitch in impression management showed up in a completely different clinical context, you really need to watch my next clinical breakdown right here. Have you ever felt that gut instinct that someone's public story didn't match their private behavior? And did you trust that feeling? Or did you talk yourself out of it? That's something to think about.